Hi, everybody. I'm John Delano. No, you're not watching KDKA TV. I have the great honor of moderating this annual fundraising event for the Historical Society of Mount Lebanon, whose board I serve on. Yes, this annual event has gone virtual for the first and hopefully the last time. We hope to be back together again next year for the annual dinner that many of you have attended in the past. In our program tonight, we are going to celebrate the 1920s. You know, the roaring 20s, the 20s of Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, the 20s that brought us flappers, the Charleston, Prohibition, and yes, the culmination of the women's suffrage movement, when women like my grandmother got to vote for the first time in a presidential election back in 1920. Any of you remember Mount Lebanon in the 1920s? I don't, of course, but I guess it's appropriate the Historical Society would ask a relic like me to moderate. I've been in Mount Lebanon off and on since 1958, went to Markham, Mellon, and of course the high school. And of course we have many others with much deeper roots, along with the newcomers who came here in the 1970s or 1980s. I kid, of course. Whether you have lived here for 90 plus years or just arrived, we at the Historical Society welcome you warmly and invite you to become part of our effort to preserve the history that you, yes, you are making every day in this community. Now, this is a fundraiser, so please go to our website at lebohistory.givesmart.com to participate. Every purchase, bid, and donation supports the important work of preserving and sharing Mount Lebanon's history, and we need you to support the continuing mission of this organization. The auction site remains open until 9 p.m. on the night of this program. This is your last chance to bid on auction items. Of course, we always welcome your online donations, your purchase of wish list items, or naming rights for spaces at the History Center. Now, we have a fun and informative program planned for you over the next hour, with some of Pittsburgh and Mount Lebanon's best-known speakers giving us their time and expertise in support of the Historical Society. You're going to hear from Louise Sturgis, former executive director of Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation, Leslie Sabilik, senior curator at the Senator John Hines History Center, Eileen Olmsted, communications director for the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania, and Jim O'Brien, the well-known Pittsburgh sports author. But to kick off this program, let me introduce Dr. Michael Cahall, president of the Historical Society of Mount Lebanon. Mike has been instrumental in so much that the Historical Society has done in recent years, and he has announced that he will be stepping down as president at the end of this year. Now, he's entitled to a break, but we will miss him greatly. Mike, thank you so much for all your service, and for the official welcome, take it away.
Good evening. My name is Mike Cahall, and as the current president of the Historical Society of Mount Lebanon, it is my honor, indeed it is my pleasure, to welcome you to this online gala event. Tonight we celebrate the centennial of the 1920 ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, guaranteeing women's suffrage, and we'll learn about some of the significant changes that tumultuous and roaring decade brought to our Mount Lebanon community. For many years, Historical Society members have gathered for an annual dinner to enjoy one another's company, partake of good food and drink, and hopefully to learn a little history along the way. Unfortunately, this year's annual dinner was one of the first victims of the coronavirus pandemic. The organizing committee recognized early on that they could not guarantee that we would be in a position to hold an annual dinner this year. But this amazing group quickly shifted gears and conceived, planned, and brought this evening into reality. So my first order of business is to thank the members of the organizing committee for all of their hard work. Members include Chair Amanda Gillen, Karen Cahall, Jody Colby, Kathy Hayes, Alyssa Jones, Susan Morgans, Elizabeth Romig, and Peggy Wojcik. Normally, I would have had them stand for public recognition, but that's not possible tonight. Nevertheless, I hope they realize how much we all appreciate their ingenuity, creativity, and hard work. I would also like to recognize our corporate sponsors, Bogner and Company and the Bogner family, and Jim Zelenka from Baron James, who once again have generously supported the Historical Society. Individual members of the Society, too many to mention individually, responded to a request for advance donations, and I thank them for their contributions. Through ticket sales, raffles, and auctions, the annual dinner has provided significant support for the Society's operating budget over the years. The need for such funds is even more critical this year. Other revenue streams have declined significantly because of the pandemic. I hope you will take time before the evening is over to visit the online auction to see how you can help. You can bid on over 16 amazing items donated by local businesses and individuals. There are also specific wish list requests for society needs. And of course, cash donations are always gratefully received. Your support will help the Society continue to fulfill its mission of preserving and interpreting the history of Mount Lebanon to the community and the wider region. The auction will remain open until 9 p.m. One of the first actions the board took in light of the expanding pandemic was to close the History Center in mid-March. At that time, no one thought we would still be closed 6 months later. Tonight, I am very happy to report that the center reopened for visitors this past Saturday. For the foreseeable future, we will be open Saturdays from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m., and as conditions permit, we will add hours to return to our full schedule. The Society is following CDC and other mandated guidelines to protect the safety and health of our visitors and volunteers alike. Our new exhibit, Then and Now Along Washington Road, 1964 and 1929, is an exhibit of photographs taken in 1964 as part of a Mount Lebanon community survey and images taken from the same locations last year. Come and see what has changed and what has remained the same. You can also contribute your own memories of the buildings and businesses along one of Mount Lebanon's main streets to the exhibit. Thank you everyone for attending tonight's gala celebration of Mount Lebanon in the 1920s and for your continuing support of the Historical Society of Mount Lebanon. So now all you flappers and swells, sit back, pour yourselves another glass of giggle juice and enjoy this Jake evening. It'll be the bee's knees.
Thank you, Mike. You know, Mount Lebanon as we know it today was in many ways created in the 1920s. When the Liberty Tunnel opened in 1924, that 6,000-foot tunnel was the longest automobile tunnel in the world. And it allowed for suburban living and commuting in the communities south of Mount Washington, like this one. Now, some of our most beloved Mount Lebanon buildings today were built in the 1920s. That includes my house, built in 1929. Well, it's not exactly beloved, except by my family, I suppose, but many of your homes may be just like mine, dating back to the 1920s. Now, to tell us more about the buildings of that era, we are so delighted to introduce Louise Sturgis, a fifth-generation Pittsburgher and resident of Mount Lebanon. Louise has worked with the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation since 1981. She has helped create place-based educational programs for people of all ages, edited more than 20 major books on the region's architectural heritage, and worked with school students to create several murals and many poetry and art books. For the last 20 years, Louise has worked with the Historical Society of Mount Lebanon to lead second grade students from all 7 elementary schools on walking tours of Washington Road. In all that she does, Louise helps people see the beauty in their built environment and feel a greater connection to their hometown. Louise, thank you for all you do. The floor, or shall we say the video screen, is all yours.
Good evening. I'm Louise Sturgis, and I'm happy to be with you tonight. I'm a fifth-generation Pittsburgher, and I have enjoyed a long career with the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation since 1981, and I'm a resident of Mount Lebanon and have worked with the school district with both the Mount Lebanon Historical Society and History and Landmarks on wonderful walking tours along Washington Road. So today I've been asked to talk with you briefly about Washington Road and what it might have been like in the 1920s. The 1920s were roaring in Mount Lebanon. Just think of what was being constructed along Washington Road between Castle Shannon Boulevard and Clearview Common, an area of only a few blocks. Washington School was designed and built in 1922-23, where an apple orchard had been. The Rosalia and Homeland buildings are both from 1927. Southminster Church dates to 1928, and the progressive Art Deco Municipal Building was designed and built in 1929-30. The Historical Society of Mount Lebanon is housed in a significant Spanish-style building constructed in the 1930s, reflecting the fact that some positive momentum from the 1920s carried on into the Great Depression years. With the opening of the Liberty Tunnels in 1924 and the Liberty Bridge in 1928, thousands of people moved out to Mount Lebanon. Between 1920 and 1930, the township's population skyrocketed from 2,258 to 13,403. Here in the hills, on land several hundred feet higher than in downtown Pittsburgh, it was possible to have a clear view, to breathe fresh air, and to live in a community with modern amenities and a garage for your automobile. Washington Road became and remains the commercial heart of Mount Lebanon. There is so much to admire and enjoy. Most of the buildings have a similar scale, a human scale. They are well constructed and display a variety of architectural styles. If you look up and around, you'll find many decorative details to delight the eye. Many of the buildings were designed for mixed uses. Together, they allow for a rich diversity of experiences. We're fortunate that so many of the historic buildings have survived and have been properly cared for. And we're fortunate that others have been recycled for new uses. Grandpa Joe's Candy Shop brings new life to the first floor of an exuberant building with Gothic detailing from 1929. The continuing existence of our historic buildings lends a valuable sense of continuity to our community by creating an environment that is familiar, recognizable, and beloved. Traveling south from Pittsburgh and on through Dormont, you know you are nearing home when Washington Road rises and a handsome collection of historic religious properties comes into view. Then, the road slopes slightly downward to reveal two stone gate piers and the Victorian frame house of Mount Lebanon Cemetery, reminding you that others have been here before you. Washington Road levels out and rides the ridge of the hill. And then, best of all, it bends slightly to the right where an eagle with upraised wings calls attention to the Howard Hanna Building, an elaborately ornamented corner building from the early 1930s. The municipal building and a whole new stretch of beauty comes into view. Many of the buildings along Washington Road are included in the Mount Lebanon Historic District, a National Register designation. And some of the most recognizable and well-used still display their 1920s and 1930s energy, pride, and optimism. A century later, Mount Lebanon's commercial district has held on to much of its historic character. Let's keep it that way. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks, Louise. Louise just showed us the many places in Mount Lebanon that we know and love. Next, Jim Wojcik, former president and board member of the Historical Society, takes us on a quick tour of the Mount Lebanon building most important to us, the History Center on Washington Road. Now, Jim has been instrumental in restoring this one-time residential home and office into the archival repository and educational center for Mount Lebanon history. If you have anything that relates to Mount Lebanon's history, and I have a ton of it in my basement and attic, please donate it to the Historical Society to be saved in this building so that future historians can learn from your donation. Jim's vision and tenacity have been a godsend to this project, and I am so delighted to introduce him for more on what this History Center will mean for the future. Jim?
Hi, I'm Jim Wojcik. I'm a past president of the Historical Society of Mount Lebanon and the current capital campaign chair for the society. I want to thank you all for being part of making Mount Lebanon history by participating in our first ever virtual fundraising event. So we're all making history here, and I want to thank you so much. And please consider making a donation or buying a wish list item or bidding on an auction item. It's so important to allow us to continue doing what we do for the community. I'm going to give you a brief look of the History Center and our restoration and renovations that we've done. We're actually started to reopen so that you can actually come and visit the History Center, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But I really hope that you would come and see the space. It's a really wonderful space. It's a great building. The house itself was built in the late 1920s, early 1930s. It's a Spanish colonial revival style, which is, it's one of what we believe 6 Spanish colonial revival style houses in Mount Lebanon. 3 families owned the house until the Mount Lebanon Parking Authority purchased it in 1982. Their plans were to buy up all the houses along Washington Road and behind on Florida Avenue and build another Washington Square condo complex. Those plans fell through, and then the house then proceeded to become an office rental through the parking authority. You may remember the Mount Lebanon tax office rented the first floor with SHACOG, the South Hills Area Council of Governments, renting space on the second floor. When the tax office moved into the municipal building, SHACOG basically took over the entire building, and they did things that would be typical as an office. If you look on the left-hand side, things like they put drop ceilings into the space, they added walls to make offices and partitions, painted walls, put commercial carpeting down over the hardwood floors and the ceramic tile that was in one of the rooms. And then also, drilled holes in walls to run wiring and cables and what have you. They removed a working fountain in the atrium and also removed the skylight, which was over some stained glass ceiling panels in that same atrium room. The picture on the left is typical of what occurred. If you see the archway in the back of the picture with all the paraphernalia, the shelves, that was open originally in the house, and they put a wall up there. You can see the drop ceiling. On the right-hand side, the doorway was installed where that was an open pass-through walkway, carpeting on the floors. So that's kind of what they did throughout the building. In the fall of 2014, the Historical Society entered into an agreement with the municipality to basically take over the entire building and turn it into a permanent history center. What you see on the right is our first demolition project by our group of volunteers, and they basically took down that wall that you see between the dining room, former dining room, and the living room. We actually used a bunch of volunteers at different points in the process where we could. Here you can see we removed the paraphernalia for the stain, for the drop ceilings. On the right, you see volunteers removing a skim coat of plaster and paint to reveal kind of the original walls that you see. When things got more complicated and complex, we had contractors. On the left, you can see we're getting ready to remove some asbestos tile that was on the ground floor. And then on the right, you can see contractor employees removing all the drop ceilings, or all the ceilings, I say, on the first floor. That allowed us to get access to the knob and tube wiring, and then also access to some reinforcement we had to do to the joists. The other thing is the roof leaked so badly. When it rained outside, it rained inside. So there was lots of damage done to the ceilings, and it was just easier to rip them all out rather than try to just patch. One of the things we didn't know about that existed, but it was covered up by paint, was a mural in the atrium on all four walls. And if you can see on the upper right-hand corner is a picture of the third family that lived there. That's Dr. Donald McMillan, his wife Christine, and his 4 children. In the background, you can see the part of the mural that existed there. They're sitting on that fountain that was removed by Shaycog, and it shows you the style of the mural is called trompe l'oeil, which means fool the eye. We brought in Boris Bridnar, who's the chief conservator from the A.J. Votter Company, and he verified that yes, the mural is there, it is recoverable. In fact, A.J. Votter donated 4 days of his time to remove the paint from a large section of the mural, just to show kind of what's possible in doing restoration work, and that you can see on the left. Now, what we didn't know about was this. We found some decorative artwork in the former dining room and living rooms, and we brought Boris back. And you can see here, he's unveiling this wonderful little lady in the former dining room. And you can see that she's on all 4 walls. She's hand painted. She has other scroll work around her. Also, what you can see is some of the holes that were put in walls and wires run there when it was an office. We also, if it was in the dining room, he looked in the living room, and here's where we saw additional decorative artwork, again, on all 4 walls. If you look closely to the right, you can see a crest with 2 griffins on either side and the letter O in the middle of the crest. Well, that kind of tells us that this was probably original artwork to the home, because the first family that owned the house and built the house was Edward J. and Lauren Ohm, O-H-L. So the other thing we knew about was this stained glass ceiling panels that were hidden under a drop ceiling. And this is the before picture of these stained glass panels. We sent them out to Williams Stained Glass to restore them, and here they are when they were brought back. A great story is one of our volunteers was here when they were bringing the panels back, And what they had, what he said was, those can't be ours. Those are too nice. And well, it turns out they really were. And here's what it now looks like with the new stained glass panels. And also when we replaced that leaky roof, we put in the skylights back. So this is another picture of the atrium. That's the original ceramic tile floor. It's you can see the workers spent a week removing the glue that was used to glue the carpeting to the tile. And so that is what you see there is now the restored floor, which is original to the house. Some of the other things we had to do with it is we realized we're building a history center and not a historic house. So we had to make some compromises, and we relied heavily on our architect that we used, who was Joel Kluski of RSH Architecture. And what you see on the left is now our handicapped accessible bathroom. It's in the same location as the original bathroom was in the house. But now it's handicapped accessible. And one of the things that Joel specified was to use the colors and the types of tile to mimic what was there originally. So although it's not original, for instance, it gives you the look and feel of what it was like back when the house was built. On the right, what you see is we needed a way to get visitors that couldn't negotiate the 4 steps to get from the first exhibit room to the rest of the first floor. So what we did was enclosed a side porch and installed a handicapped lift that you see on the right. So now visitors have access to the entire first floor of the space. Here's a picture of the restored dining room, former dining room. We've since using Williams stained glass, took care of all the renovated the casement windows you see, including the 2 that were missing in the that you see in this picture. And if you come to the History Center, we can tell you all about the story of those stained glass casement windows. Here's the restored fireplace with the treatment. It brings out the great detail. And on the right-hand picture, you can see that when we did the final finished painting, we stopped just below the decorative artwork in both the living room and dining room to make it much easier for our conservator to go back and do the restoration without having to remove an extra coat of paint. Plus, it gives you more of a feel for what this house was like in its glory. So this is now a view from that same office that I showed you originally, but now you can see it's been restored. The wall's gone. We did find a railing that's original to the house that wasn't there when we tore the wall down. And again, another great story that you need to come visit the History Center to find out how we found that. And then what I want to then tell you is that we opened on September 2018 in the new space. It was the centennial, the Mount Lebanon Fire Department that year, and that was our first exhibit. Here you can see all 3 exhibit spaces on the right-hand picture. We're standing in the first exhibit space, the atriums on the left, and the former dining rooms on the right. Our second exhibit was We Can Do It, World War II. This is a traveling exhibit from the Heinz History Center that, with our affiliation with the Heinz History Center, we were awarded to be the first South Hills area site to host this traveling exhibit for over 2.5 months. It was something that, had we not done the renovations, we never would have been able to even apply for, let alone receive this exhibit. And it was a simply wonderful exhibit. One of the things we actually did do in the course of while it was there was working through the Veterans Breakfast Club. We invited in some World War II veterans to come and talk to any visitors that came into the History Center. Here you see this gentleman who is a Marine who landed on Iwo Jima and fought there, and he simply captivated the people that came to visit, as you can see. Since then, after those exhibits, we had one about the history of the house, and then a very popular exhibit about the 18 different religious entities that exist in Mount Lebanon. But our current exhibit is now Then and Now along Washington Road, 1964 and 2019. This exhibit is open now. We're starting Saturdays from 9 to noon. As we get more comfortable with our process and procedures, we'll expand that. You can see we've got Rosie the Riveter asking you to, when you come into the History Center, to wear a mask. We've got sanitizing stations, and our volunteers will be disinfecting all the touch surfaces. A little bit about the exhibit. We look at what's occurred along Uptown Washington Road between 1964 and 2019. We have a series of pictures that were taken in 1964 that we then replicated the perspective back in 2019. And so what you can see is what stayed the same and what changed in the last 55 years in Uptown Mount Lebanon. On the right, you can see Rollier's Hardware Store, which is now. And then if you look back on the left, you can see that same spot back in 1964 was an automobile dealership car lot. And so that's there. Also, is kind of a neat part of this exhibit is we ask visitors to contribute their stories to their memories and of those different places with little index cards that they can then place through there. So this now also shows you like the Dennis Theater then in 1964 and now what it looks like. You'll have to, if you come into the History Center, you can see what was playing back in 1964 at the Dennis Theater. So that's, I hope, gives you a little bit of a tease of what this History Center looks like. And it's really a wonderful place, and it's a unique building and space that we'd love to share with the community. So please help continue supporting us, and I thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Jim. Well, no one thinks of the 1920s without thinking of Prohibition. We are so pleased that Leslie Sabilik, curator from the Senator John Heinz History Center, is here with us to give us the scoop on Prohibition in Pittsburgh. Hey, any of you remember how Mount Lebanon was a mostly dry town for years, long after Prohibition? Liquor licenses were finally issued in 1975, and the next year the saloon opened up in Uptown Mount Lebanon. We weren't completely dry after Prohibition. Here's some more historical trivia for you. 2 locations had liquor licenses before 1975. Atria's, still operating at the corner of Beverly and McFarland, and one other that I remember, Andy's Loop Cafe. Anyone else remember that wonderful dive at the end of the old streetcar line uptown? Well, I digress. Hey, Leslie Sabilik explores popular culture, technology, history, and foodways of the 19th and 20th century, as well as lots of other topics, as senior curator at the Senator John Heinz History Center. A native of Western Pennsylvania, Leslie has spent her public history career encouraging people to think more deeply about the stories of their local communities. She has curated multiple popular exhibitions at the History Center, including We Can Do It, World War II, Pittsburgh's Lost Steamboat, Treasures of the Arabia, and American Spirits, the Rise and Fall of Prohibition. I can't think of anyone more qualified to help us understand Prohibition. Leslie, thank you for joining us, and it's all yours.
So first of all, to all the members of the Mount Lebanon Historical Society, it's my pleasure to be here with you this evening, and I wish you all the best on this fundraiser. I hope it does smashingly well. And welcome to the 1920s. So my charge this evening is to give you a very quick overview of the topic of prohibition. I have to say, this is one of those topics that as a curator and a public historian, I really enjoy because on the one hand, it's very well known. I'm sure you're sitting there this evening and you all have a certain set of images in your head about what prohibition means, and yet it's also unknown at the same time. Now, I have about 10 minutes or so I'm going to distill this down to a couple main points. And I'm sorry, I had to do that, distill. And one of those, to start off, is this, that prohibition wasn't some fringe belief that a few people kind of forced on everybody else. At one point, a majority of Americans supported it. Think about your own household, your family, your friends, your neighbors who are joining you virtually in their own households this evening. Many of you may have supported prohibition. For more than 100 years, it was this debate that came on, and a lot of people truly believed that it would help America in the economy, social issues, and especially if you were Protestant, if you were an advocate of progressive politics, certainly if you were a supporter of women's suffrage. Remember, the 18th Amendment, prohibition, is ratified in 1919 and goes into effect in 1920. The 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, is the very next one to pass. So kind of entwined were temperance and women's suffrage issues that the American brewing industry actually had a standing policy to oppose all platforms that supported women's suffrage because they saw those issues as so linked. So many of you could have supported it, at least at first. What happens over time is that there's a set of factors that really made prohibition problematic to understand and enforce, and it led to a dramatic change in American behavior. There are other factors too, but one of those to start off with is that, frankly, prohibition was confusing. You know, when the 18th Amendment is ratified on January 16th, 1919, then there's a year before it actually goes into effect, and they literally define the year, and then on January 17th, 1920, prohibition goes into effect. On the one hand, you have a group like the Mount Lebanon and Dormont Women's Christian Temperance Union that celebrated this. They held an all-day event at the Mount Lebanon Presbyterian Church where they had speeches and talks, and they toasted the advent of prohibition. One presumes they toasted with, I guess, grape juice or ginger ale. Then at the same time, you have the Pittsburgh Daily Post, which is so concerned about people not understanding what prohibition really is and how you follow the rules, that they publish one of those box headlines that says what you can and cannot do under the new dry laws. And here are just a few of them. You know, you could keep your own stash of liquor, you could drink it, and you could offer that to your bona fide friends. You could store liquor in your own warehouse, but think about that, because you couldn't then transport that liquor from your warehouse to your house. Unless you, of course, had secret passageways that allowed you to do that without anybody seeing it. You could, if you were ill, get a prescription for medicinal whiskey every 10 months. That loophole was exploited right away. And I haven't seen the information on how badly that might have been exploited in the Pittsburgh area yet, but I know there's a great article about a pharmacist in Chicago. By March 1920, he's lamenting that he's exhausted because in 1 month, from February to March 1920, he wrote 7,500 prescriptions for medicinal whiskey. Now, what you couldn't do, you couldn't manufacture, transport, or sell any alcohol. You couldn't go to a private club or a hotel and drink their stash. You're paying a membership fee, or you're paying to stay there. That's commerce. But if you maintained a residence there and you controlled the liquor within your purview, your set of rooms, then it was legal. You can imagine there again what kinds of loopholes, what kinds of laws people are going to break when you have that sort of set up as your parameter. There were also licenses that allowed you to produce a certain amount of home wine for your own or sacramental use. So prohibition was a set of both laws and loopholes. And, for something that was so ingrained in many respects as part of people's culture, they were going to exploit that. And they found every avenue to do so. The other side of this is that there were always jurisdiction questions in prohibition. It's a federal law. The federal forces designed to enforce prohibition were never in the numbers that they needed to be to truly be effective. Instead, the federal forces looked to the states to enforce prohibition. The states looked to the county and local governments. The local governments in places like Homestead or Braddock or Pittsburgh looked around and said, yeah, we're not doing that. And in fact, in many cases, from the south side to towns along the Mon River in Fayette County, frankly, the county and the local police forces were sometimes in cahoots with the people who were, say, supplying liquor to the local saloons. They had entire networks in place to vet who was going to still sell in their speakeasies. So there were multiple ways that these laws were kind of perverted in a sense. Now, prohibition also, to many people, represented kind of a version of class warfare. Those same groups and communities, for example, like Homestead, the ethnic communities where Prohibition and the Anti-Saloon League, which was the lobbying group that really finally succeeded in getting Prohibition passed, largely by targeting the saloon, those groups look at this and say, well, excuse me, you've made it impossible for us to function with our working man's clubs, but nobody believed that, for example, the Duquesne Club wasn't going to have a private stash and we're figuring out a way to use it. And people who had the economic wherewithal to bring about their own stash of liquor also were advantaged over someone where, what you did was you produced enough for your home and you maybe sold a little bit to your friends. So you create this tension from the beginning. That's something that was reflected in coverage of probably the most famous story related to Prohibition to come out of Mount Lebanon. And that's the case involving the Volpe brothers and John Bassano, whose, as the newspapers put it, his exclusive mansion at 1287 Washington Road in Mount Lebanon becomes this kind of visual symbol of the dichotomy of the working class side of this and those people who can get away to the suburbs, where the newspapers who are giving a rough account of the story, the Volpe brothers try to encroach into territory in East Liberty, and John Bassano and his network kind of take them out, at least take some of them out in retaliation. And then Bassano himself is hit in New York City because what he did was seen as an unsanctioned hit. But the newspaper coverage really emphasizes this dichotomy between this working class family from Wilmerding, and here's this commercial building that they live in, and here's this lovely mansion on Washington Road. I don't want to get into the story of the criminality behind this because I don't have time in this brief talk, but it's the image that it represented of two different worlds colliding. And this person who thought he was escaping out beyond the racketeering districts in Mount Lebanon couldn't escape what happens. Those jurisdiction issues play into other aspects of a community like Mount Lebanon. You have the community itself is growing during this period. You have the opening of the Liberty Tunnels in 22, the opening of the Liberty Bridge a few years later. It's easier for criminals, it's easier for bootleggers to get back and forth. If Prohibition had happened in the 1880s, when transportation options were more limited, and an earlier experiment in Pittsburgh with high license fees for saloon really drastically cut the number, and there was a lot of behind-the-scenes dealing. The term speakeasy, in both reality and oral folklore, actually emerges from the 1880s, but there simply wasn't the transportation network in place to turn it into the business it becomes. It's really the combination of the confusing laws, the jurisdiction, and cars, trucks, faster means to get around that explodes things during Prohibition. And, there are classic examples. A motorcycle cop, for example, in Mount Lebanon, chases a rum runner to Bridgeville. And what happens is that the citizens of Bridgeville really impede the motorcycle cop from stopping the rum runner. And The motorcycle police officer from Mount Lebanon even charges that the Bridgeville officers helped the people who were trying to impede this person being caught. I don't want to go into the background of is that true or not, but it's the symbol behind stories like that that really is important, that prohibition in effect not only pitted groups against each other, it kind of pitted municipalities against each other. You know, the other piece I would add is this, that ultimately prohibition changed the way that Americans drank, the way that they engaged with alcohol. When prohibition was ushered in, and you see some great articles about this, people remembered that, you know, John Barleycorn was saluted away by a bunch of men sitting at that saloon bar. He's welcomed back with women and men in supper clubs. In fact, the William Penn Hotel, they waited. When prohibition is repealed, it actually is repealed earlier than people anticipated, 5:30. And some groups, like the William Penn, they waited until 10 to open their Chatterbox Supper Club. And I will say that the first couple to toast in the repeal at the Chatterbox Supper Club at the William Penn Hotel was a couple from Mount Lebanon. But what everybody acknowledged was now, and remember, that's a couple from Mount Lebanon, is that the people who are welcoming John Barleycorn's return are men and women, young women, gray-haired women, everybody. Prohibition wasn't a total failure. For at least 40, 50 years afterwards, the American public really did drink less, but they were all drinking together. And so it's this great example of a complicated little story that had both positive outcomes and negative outcomes, but it wasn't the simple story that we perceive from those stereotypes. And I hope that the other sessions tonight will help you explore this topic a little more. As I said, it truly is my pleasure to be here in support of your event. And what I'll say is that I'm going to offer a toast. This is my toast to the Mount Lebanon Historical Society and your 1920 fundraiser this evening, and best wishes and good luck.
Hey, thank you, Leslie. Well, as you all know, in 1920, the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote was finally ratified. And many women cast their first ballots that year, including my grandmother Delano. That was 100 years ago and way overdue. But even after suffrage, it took decades for women to hold political positions in this region. And sadly, we are still not there completely. Now, the late Mary Larson was the first woman elected township commissioner in Mount Lebanon. A Republican, she was elected in 1977 in the Second Ward, more than 50 years after women's suffrage. She was succeeded by my mother, June Delano, the first Democratic woman elected commissioner. Mary and June were very close and dear friends and co-founders of the Mount Lebanon League of Women Voters back in the 1950s, which has since merged with the Greater Pittsburgh League. Here to talk about what suffrage looked like in Pittsburgh and this region, and also to explore how voting rights were not equitable among all women across the country, is Eileen Olmstead, Communications Director of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania, in conversation with Historical Society board member Amanda Gillen. Now, having lived in South America for most of her childhood, and then having spent nearly her early adulthood in the Middle East, where she lived for 12 years, Eileen was very interested in becoming involved in an organization known for its promotion of civic involvement, because as a resident in a foreign country, she did not have that opportunity or privilege. When Eileen finally settled down in California in 1977 and later in Pittsburgh, she began a 30-year career with the League of Women Voters, holding many positions over the years. When she moved to Pittsburgh to be close to her grandchildren, she joined the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh, where she served on the board in various capacities. Currently, she serves on the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania's board as Communications Director. Eileen, thanks for all you do. And Amanda and Eileen, it's now all yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Gillen. I am the chair of this Mount Lebanon Historical Society fundraising event, and I'm also on the board of the Historical Society. And I thank you all for being with us tonight for this wonderful program. I'm really pleased to have with us Eileen Olmsted, who is the Communications Director of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania for the board. And, you know, when we think of the 1920s, something that immediately comes to mind, in addition to prohibition, is the suffrage movement and women getting the right to vote. And Ms. Olmsted is here with us tonight to talk a little bit more about that. We have a couple of questions that we will explore together. Welcome, thank you for being here. And I think the first question, you know, this is a local historical society, and so I'm very curious as to what happened in Allegheny County in the aftermath after passing the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote.
Well, as you may or may not know, even before the 19th Amendment was completely ratified, about 6 months before, but the women who had been so involved in the last few years before the passage of the 19th Amendment were convinced that it would be ratified, although it was touch and go in several states. They formed, even before the ratification, they formed the League of Women Voters of the United States, the National League of Women Voters. I think it was called the National League of Women Voters. And it was made up of women who had been in the forefront of the suffrage movement. It was founded by a woman called Carrie Chapman Catt, who had been president of the American women's suffrage movement. I get these names mixed up because they kept changing, but that was the general gist of it. Carrie Chapman Catt felt that the fight was only just beginning. In other words, she felt that it was very necessary, not just that women get the vote, but that they become educated voters and know what they were doing when they came to the vote. One of the interesting things about the women's suffrage, what happened at that point, was that despite the fact that before the League was formed, many of the women's suffrage groups, subgroups, had endorsed particular candidates and pushed for people, at that time men only, to elect certain candidates who supported their views or supported, and not just on women's suffrage, but on issues like child labor, rights of women to have their own property, to have their own, able to control their own money. So, but at the point of forming the League of Women Voters, they made the decision to be nonpartisan. And I was just reading an article recently about that in some ways it hurt the League, because they refused to endorse anybody. And so there was nobody looking for their endorsement. And so, but in the long run, I think that was a very, very good decision, because nowadays we are very, very well known for being nonpartisan and for providing information to voters in a nonpartisan way, so they can trust us to be telling them the truth. But anyway, so of course, Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh had been a very big part of the suffrage movement. It was very active all over Pennsylvania. There's a famous story a couple of years before of women getting together and driving around the state of Pennsylvania, trying to get the state legislature to actually pass the women's vote before the national amendment. And so they drove around the state having with a bell in the back of a truck that had been cast to look like the Liberty Bell, but the clapper was tied to the side, and they drove around the state pushing the state legislature to pass an amendment to the Pennsylvania Constitution to make it legal for women to vote. And the clapper was going to ring when women got the vote. Well, of course, that particular piece of legislation never passed. So women in Pennsylvania had to wait until the national Congress passed the 19th Amendment and Pennsylvania ratified it before they actually got the vote. But the league in Allegheny County was a very active league. It was called the Allegheny County League of Women Voters right from 1920. So we're all celebrating our 100th birthday this year. This particular league was made up of men of property's wives. In other words, they were movers and shakers in the community, and by that definition tended to be upper middle class white women. And this was true all over the country in terms of the suffrage movement. Nevertheless, there were many, many African American women who worked very, very hard to help achieve the suffrage. They tended to be working more to improve the conditions of all society rather than focusing just on the subject of women, but they knew that without passing women's suffrage, that wouldn't happen. So they worked very hard on it. But the Allegheny League of Women's Voters, we don't have records that go back to 1920, unfortunately. But we do know that generally speaking, overall in the country, the league was not particularly welcoming to women of color. It varied a lot from district and area, but there had been something of a bitter rift between African American women and the bulk of the suffrage movement, because at various points there had been actively some sort of active rejection of having African American women be very involved. And this had to do with two issues. One was because of prejudice on the part of the southern states, and the women who were fighting for suffrage knew that they had to have the votes of the southern states. And so they did not want to emphasize the fact that Black women would be getting the vote at the same time as white women would be getting the vote. And so they didn't, even though individually a lot of women in the suffrage movement favored and supported Black women, organizationally that was not true. It was more a strategic decision and a decision what would be the best for the movement as a whole. So I wonder, I don't have any records, but I wonder a little bit what happened to those Black women in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County who were active in the suffrage movement after the formation of the League of Women Voters, which was the organization that most women joined. If they were going to join any organization, they joined the League of Women Voters.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk with us about this today. Obviously, we are right before an important election. We are all thinking about ballots and voting, and how we'll each take advantage of this right that we have, that these women fought for. There's so much history out there, so many resources. This is one small snippet of our history here in Allegheny County from the 1920s, but arguably 100 years later, it is as relevant and as important, and this work.
Yes, absolutely. I did want to mention a couple of women who were quite well known in the African American community. One of them was Daisy Elizabeth Adams Lambkin, and she was a very active suffragist before 1920. She was the president of the Lucy Stone League, which was a league that was founded and continues to exist to this day. Lucy Stone was a leader, one of the first leaders of the suffrage movement, and one of the aspects of her leadership was that she refused to take her husband's name when she married. So anybody who was involved with the Lucy Stone League, and she was white, but a lot of African Americans really identified with her. She was a suffragist, but she was also an abolitionist. So they identified with her. And so Lucy Stoners were people who believed that you should not take your husband's name when you married. It took a long time for that really to gain ground. But Daisy Elizabeth Adams Lampkin was a prominent Pittsburgher before and after 1920. She, as I said, she was the president of the Lucy Stone League, and she was very involved later, after, in the 1920s, with other Black organizations, including the National, she was a chairman of the National Board of the National Association of Colored Women. She also was on one of the initial founders of the National Association of the NAACP, and she was the secretary of the national organization and it was on the first board. She also, interestingly enough, was an entrepreneur, and she was married to a restaurateur, but she was recognized in her own name. She became a supporter and a stockholder of the Pittsburgh Courier, which the New Pittsburgh Courier is the current version of the Pittsburgh Courier, which is over 100 years old, and was for many years the premier newspaper for the Black community all over the country, not just in Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. And she was a stockholder and a member of their board in the 1920s and 30s. So she was also very active on a national level in a couple of in the Urban League, the NAACP. She founded the first Red Cross chapter in Pittsburgh. And one of the things that I do know, even though I had to acknowledge the racism within and without the suffrage movement, was that in Pittsburgh, at least leading up to the 1920 ratification, it was one of the few places where, when there were parades in the streets to support the suffrage movement, both Black and white women marched together. In the national parade in 1913, there was a very bitter split, and Black women were only allowed to march in the national parade if they came at the end of the parade. So as a League member of many years, I've been a member of the League for over 40 years, it's only been this year when I started really looking at the history of the suffrage movement and this history of the League that I've realized that we in the League don't have such a great heritage, although we are very much changed today in terms of our outreach and our welcoming of all races and sexual orientation, that in the early days we did not behave as we might have if we had been a little bit more open to different members of our society. But learning about Daisy Elizabeth Adams Lampkin and how influential and how, and I have no record whether she belonged to the League or not, because we don't have early records. It would be wonderful to know, but she was definitely working in organizations that work closely with the League. The National Association of Colored Women is mentioned in histories of the League of Women Voters as one of the organizations that the two women's organizations work closely. So she must have been very much aware and involved, if she wasn't an actual member of the League, which I have no way of finding out, I'm afraid, because I've just read a history of the Black woman in the League, which was written by a former president of the League of Women Voters, who was the first African-American president of the League back in the 90s. And now we have our current national president is also African-American and a very distinguished woman. So I think we've come full circle, and I hope that the League members in Pittsburgh and the African-American leaders in the suffrage movement in Pittsburgh had a slightly better relationship than we know of at the national level.
Thank you for your time to talk about all of this with us. I learned so much from you today, and I feel like there's a lot more learning and reading and thinking to be done. I am grateful to you, and on behalf of the Historical Society of Mount Lebanon, I thank you for joining us very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Eileen. Well, it's been a great program so far, but we're not done yet. Our final speaker is the renowned and incomparable local sports writer, Jim O'Brien. Now, I've had the pleasure of interviewing Jim a number of times over the years, and there is very little about sports in this region that he doesn't know about. Just check out the titles to a few of his many books. The Chief, Art Rooney and his Pittsburgh Steelers. How about We Had 'Em All the Way, Bob Prince and the Pittsburgh Pirates? Or Remember Roberto, or The Steelers Stuff, and Lambert. And how about Fantasy Camp, Living the Dream with Maz and the 60 Bucks? You know, for years, Jim O'Brien has been a contributor to Mount Lebanon Magazine and a columnist for the Almanac. Myron Cope once called him Pittsburgh's premier sports author. You know, the author of 30 books in his Pittsburgh Proud series. There's no question that Myron Cope was right. For me personally, it's always a great honor to introduce my friend, Jim O'Brien. Jim?
I am very pleased to be here with local famous sports writer, Jim O'Brien. Hello,
Jim
Mr.
O'Brien is happy to be here too. He's happy to be asked by the Historical Society of Mount Lebanon to participate in this fundraising program. I've been sort of on the other side of the fence from Mount Lebanon all my life. I lived in Upper St. Clair for 40-some years, so we were rivals. But as a child, growing up in the inner city, in the community of Hazelwood, which was on the other side of the economic scale versus Mount Lebanon, which we always viewed as, first of all, it was way out in the country, so far away, and that's where all the rich people lived. All the people lived out of there, and we used to call them cake eaters. And I remember as a child, there were two football teams we used to play. One as an 8th grader at St. Stephen's, we played St. Bernard's of Mount Lebanon. And we also played in Sandlot football, a team from Homewood called the Homewood Scorpions. And what I remember best about both of them is the St. Bernard team used to arrive in 3 long golden yellow buses, pristine. And they would get off the bus in a single file, and they were all wearing the same kind of helmets as the Notre Dame football team. Hard shell helmets. And so many, they just kept coming. It was like a Cecil B. DeMille production. And then the Homewood Scorpions, they arrived in a single sort of ragged Baptist church bus, and they came in single file, and they used to scare us the way they would come across the field. But St. Bernard's had a great grade school football team, and they had a great high school team at Mount Lebanon. When they were playing Westinghouse High School, the City League champions, Pete Imperio, who was from Hazelwood, would exhort his team by telling them that all the kids on the Mount Lebanon football team all drove Cadillacs. And he would get these inner city kids all revved up to beat the heck out of those rich suburban kids. And one day when they were practicing on the football field over in the East End by Homewood, a helicopter flew over the practice field. And Pete Imperio put up his hands and he said, "Don't move. Don't anybody move." That's those Mount Lebanon people scouting us. You can't trust them. And that's the sort of image that they had, was that they had it all. And they also had, in Mount Lebanon, as I remember through the years, they had the most famous Pittsburgh broadcasters, sports broadcasters. They had, for instance, Bob Prince. Bob Prince, who was the voice of the Pirates for 28 years, lived most of that time in Mount Lebanon. And then he moved up. He moved over to Upper St. Clair, and he lived in Deerfield Manor. But Bob Prince sponsored a football team for kids in Mount Lebanon called the Mount Lebanon Wildcats. And I'm sure there's still a lot of people in Mount Lebanon who played for that team and remember that team. You have Jack Fleming, who was the voice, the play-by-play announcer for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He lived in Mount Lebanon, and he also was the voice for West Virginia football and basketball and for the Chicago Bulls. And he was really a great broadcaster, but he hated Pitt. He said he was born next to Mountaineer Stadium, and he was raised to hate Pitt. So he lived there. And then, of course, you had Mike Lang, the voice of the Penguins, and he's still living in Mount Lebanon, I believe. And all those people used to frequent the saloon owned by Jimmy Shepard, and that was a sports bar before there was such a name. No one referred to it as a sports bar. It was simply a place where people argued about sports, and there were lots of TVs. John Steigerwald used to hang around there. Lots of great football coaches. Art Walker Sr., before him, Ralph Fife, who had been an All-America football player at Pitt. And then, of course, Art Walker Jr. And now they have Bob Palko, who won 5 WPIL titles when he was at over there in Oakdale. The other people there were, you had Mario Lemieux and the Pittsburgh Penguins, and they practiced at the Mount Lebanon ice rink. That was pretty good. Yarmer Yager skated there, and when they were winning Stanley Cups in the beginning. So that was part of the legacy of Mount Lebanon sports. And of course, you had great other sports bars. You had Beto's, you had Atria's, you had Donnie de Blasio's place, and you had Jimmy Shepard at the saloon holding court. You had Dick Black, great basketball coach at Mount Lebanon. You had, followed by, you had Joey David, who's one of my all-time favorites. Joey was at Pitt when I was there. And Joey is just a gentleman, and the kids benefit. And his parents, his dad was an Orthodox priest, and his mother, Janet, was one of 13 children from Bridgeville, Pennsylvania. So he was raised right, and it's reflected by the way he conducts himself. Dick Black, by the way, can you imagine, in over 30-some years as the basketball coach at Mount Lebanon, Dick Black was never hit with a technical foul. Never, not one. So he behaved himself. And then Dory Oldacre, she's quite a coach of the women's team there. And I said you've got Bob Palko there now. So they've always had good coaches, good athletes. Don Molliner once had a great cross-country team at Mount Lebanon when I was in high school. So through the years, I've paid attention to Mount Lebanon, and they have quite a sports history, quite a sports history. I've written articles for the Mount Lebanon magazine, and in one of my 30 books in the Pittsburgh Pride series, Hometown Heroes has stories about Joey David and his father and other people from Mount Lebanon who've made their mark in sports. So it's a great city for sports. I know you wanted me to say something about what happened in sports in Mount Lebanon in the 20s. And some people might be surprised to learn this, but I'm 78 and I wasn't born until 1942. And I really wasn't aware of Mount Lebanon as a sports adversary until I was in 8th grade. So I don't remember anybody from the 20s. And I'm hoping that perhaps, do you think anybody from the 20s is watching the show?
My guess would be no. Thank you so much, Mr. O'Brien. It was wonderful to see you.
All right. Thank you, Amanda.
Hey, thanks, Jim. Well, that's a wrap, as we say in the TV biz. I hope you've enjoyed hearing these terrific guests, and thank you for supporting the Historical Society, both today and throughout the years. If you've not done so yet, please go to our website at lebohistory.givesmart.com to help us raise the money needed to serve this community. Every purchase, bid, and donation supports the important work of preserving and sharing Mount Lebanon's history. And we need your support to continue the mission of the Historical Society. Now, the auction site remains open until 9:00 p.m. on the night of this program. This is your last chance to bid on auction items or to make an online donation, purchase wish items, naming rights for spaces. We're always interested in hearing from you on those issues. And I'm very pleased to remind you that the History Center is reopening this Saturday, October 17th, from 9 a.m. to 12 noon, socially distanced and with all the proper protocols. And we'll be open every Saturday with expanded hours to come. Special thanks to all the wonderful people behind the scenes and on the screen who made this program possible. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I'm John Delano. Please stay safe and healthy, everyone.